The autumn rain fell upon Thornwood Manor like a penitent's tears, soft and unceasing, darkening the ancient stones until the great house seemed to emerge from the very mist that clung to the Yorkshire moors. It was a lonely place in late October, made lonelier still by the silence that inhabited its corridors, not the comfortable quiet of a well-ordered household, but the heavy, oppressive silence of secrets kept and words unspoken. In the east wing, behind a door of solid oak reinforced with iron hinges that had not opened in 3 years, lived Viscount Adrian Ashford, master of Thornwood and all its lands, a man who had transformed his chambers into a tomb for the living. The door itself had become an object of legend among the staff, who spoke of it in hushed tones when they thought themselves unobserved that formidable barrier, with its heavy lock, that the Viscount had installed himself in the dark days following his return from the accident, his face bandaged, his instructions delivered through gritted teeth to the carpenter, who had worked with trembling hands under that terrible, pain-filled gaze. 3 years had passed since that door had closed, 3 years during which the Viscount had not emerged, not even once, receiving his meals through a small panel that opened only when the corridor was confirmed empty, conducting all estate business through written correspondence delivered by his valet, existing as little more than a ghost in his own home. The servants whispered, of course, as servants always do, about the scars that must be terrible beyond imagining, about the limp that had ended his riding, about the darkness of spirit that had descended upon a man once known for his vigor and sharp wit. Yet it was not the Viscount alone who haunted Thornwood's halls. Lady Catherine Ashford, his wife of 3 years and 3 months, moved through the manor like a figure in a painting, beautiful, composed, and utterly still in her loneliness. She was a woman of 27, with dark hair that she wore simply, and eyes of that particular grey that shifts between storm and dove depending on the light. Each morning she walked the corridor to her husband's chambers, her footsteps soft upon the Persian runner, carrying a letter written in her careful, elegant hand. She would pause before that locked door, her fingers resting briefly against the wood, as though she might feel some warmth from the other side, some sign of the man who lived beyond it. Then she would bend gracefully and slip the letter beneath the door, watching as it disappeared into the darkness of the gap, like a prayer offered to an indifferent heaven. The household pitied her, this neglected wife who maintained her dignity in the face of such peculiar abandonment, who managed the estate with quiet competence, who never complained or wept where others might observe. They did not know, could not know, that inside her chambers at night, Catherine would sit by her window and wonder if she had ever truly been married at all, or if the entire arrangement had been nothing more than an elaborate performance that had ended the moment her husband locked himself away, leaving her neither wife nor widow, but something suspended painfully between. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. Catherine had not wanted the marriage, not truly, though she had accepted it with the quiet grace expected of a gentlewoman whose family fortunes had declined and whose prospects had narrowed to this single opportunity, a union arranged between her father and the late Viscount Ashford's solicitors, a transaction of property and bloodlines in which affection was considered a pleasant possibility but hardly a requirement. She had arrived at Thornwood Manor 3 years and 3 months ago, in the full bloom of July, when the gardens were alive with roses and the moors stretched green and gold beneath endless skies, and she had met her betrothed in the formal drawing-room where he had stood with his back to the light, a tall figure with dark hair and darker eyes, his bow precise, his words polite, his entire manner communicating a careful, cultivated distance that had made her understand immediately that whatever this marriage would be, it would not be born of passion or even particular preference on his part. Adrian had been courteous during their brief engagement, correct in every particular, but there had been no warmth in his correctness, no curiosity about the woman he was binding himself to for life. He had inquired after her comfort, ensured her rooms were prepared to her satisfaction, and discussed settlements and arrangements with her father's representative, but he had never once asked her what she hoped for, what she dreamed of, what she feared in coming to this strange house to marry a stranger. Their wedding had been a small affair, attended by distant relations and local gentry who had come more out of obligation than celebration, and their wedding night had been much like their courtship proper, passionless, a duty discharged without cruelty, but equally without tenderness, leaving Catherine to lie awake afterward, wondering if this careful emptiness was to be the shape of all her days. In the weeks that followed, they had established the patterns of a polite cohabitation, formal dinners where they discussed estate matters and weather, separate chambers connected by a door that remained perpetually closed, occasional rides where Adrian would help her mount and then ride ahead, always just slightly out of reach. She had told herself that affection might grow in time, that patience and kindness on her part might gradually thaw the ice of their arrangement, and she had set herself to learning the management of Thornwood, to winning the respect of the household staff, and to making herself useful and unobtrusive, hoping that her husband might one day look at her and see not merely a wife acquired through obligation, but a woman worthy of his regard. She had been young enough then to believe that hope alone might be sufficient, that her quiet devotion might eventually earn what had not been freely given. But she had not anticipated the accident that would come 3 months into their marriage, nor the locked door that would follow, transforming their cold union into no union at all. Now, standing in the present autumn rain, Catherine bent once more before that unyielding oak barrier and slipped her daily letter into the darkness beneath, watching it disappear as all the others had disappeared, unanswered, unacknowledged, received into a silence that had become the defining feature of her married life. The accident came on an October morning much like this one, 3 months into their marriage, when the hunting party had assembled at dawn with horses steaming in the cold air and the hounds eager, their breath clouding white as they strained at their leads. Adrian had been an accomplished rider, known throughout Yorkshire for his seat and his nerve, and Catherine had watched him depart that morning with something almost like warmth in her chest, for he had looked back at her as he mounted, a brief glance that might have held the seed of something gentler than his usual formality. The messenger had returned before noon, riding hard, his face white with what he had witnessed, and Catherine had been summoned by the housekeeper, her heart already falling even before she heard the words. An unexpected ravine concealed by underbrush. The Viscount's horse had fallen. The Viscount had been thrown against rocks. His face had struck stone. There was blood, so much blood. The doctor was already sent for, but my lady should prepare herself. They had brought him home on a cart, his face wrapped in bandages already seeping red, his left leg twisted in a way that made the footman turn away, and through the laudanum haze he had been conscious enough to refuse her entry to his chambers, his voice a ragged thing she barely recognized. No, keep her out, she must not see. Catherine had stood in the corridor while the doctor worked, had pressed her hands against the door and called his name. They had offered comfort and received only silence, punctuated by groans of agony that pierced her in ways she could not have anticipated, given the coldness of their union, for he was still her husband, still a human being suffering beyond that unyielding wood, and she found she possessed a capacity for concern that their brief, distant marriage had not yet extinguished. The doctor had emerged hours later with blood on his sleeves and gravity in his expression. The Viscount would live, but his face bore scars that would be permanent. His left leg had been set but would always pain him. He would walk with a limp, and his lordship had been most insistent violently, so that her ladyship was not to enter, was not to see him. The trauma had been not only physical but psychological. Perhaps in time his reason would return, but for now his wishes must be respected. She had tried, that first week, to reach him standing outside his door and speaking to the wood, writing letters that she slipped beneath, requesting through his valet that she be allowed to help with his recovery, to read to him, to simply sit in his presence, anything to bridge this sudden and absolute separation. But he had responded to none of it, and on the 8th day she had heard the carpenter working inside the chambers, the sound of tools and heavy iron, and when she had inquired, she learned that the Viscount had ordered a lock installed, a proper lock with a key that only he possessed. And that evening when she approached his door, she found it truly, finally, completely closed to her, and she had stood there in the dimming light, wondering how a marriage that had been merely cold could become, in the span of a week, no marriage at all, but a prison of separation in which she was condemned to live beside a husband she might never see again. Weeks passed in this manner, and Catherine found herself settling into a rhythm born not of contentment, but of sheer determination to survive the peculiar loneliness of being married, yet utterly alone, a state more isolating than widowhood, for at least widows received society's sympathy, while she received only pitying glances and whispered speculation about what failures of hers had driven her husband to such extremity. Each morning she rose at dawn, dressed with care though no one would see her except servants, and composed a letter at the small writing desk in her chamber's letters that began as desperate pleas and gradually transformed into something gentler, more patient, the chronicles of daily life that demanded nothing and offered everything. She wrote of the estate, the tenants' concerns, the harvest reports, the repairs needed on the north cottages, the accounts that required his attention, presenting these matters with clarity and her own recommendations, effectively managing Thornwood in his stead, though she signed nothing, decided nothing final, always deferring to his authority even as he exercised it only through absence. She wrote of the weather, how the autumn mists clung to the moors each morning, how the oaks in the park were turning copper and gold, how the first frost had come and silvered the lawns, how the rooks gathered in the elms at dusk, small observations that might have seemed trivial, except that they were her attempts to share the world with him, to give him windows when he had locked himself away from all light. She wrote, occasionally, carefully, of her concern for his welfare. Was he eating sufficiently? Was his leg paining him? Would he permit the doctor to call? Might he need books or anything else that she could provide? Questions posed gently, without accusation, without demands, merely offerings of care that she folded into cream-colored paper and slipped beneath his door each morning before the household fully woke. After delivering each letter, she would proceed to the library, a long room with tall windows overlooking the gardens, separated from Adrian's chambers by only a single wall, and there she would spend her mornings reading, managing correspondence, reviewing the household accounts, always conscious that he was there, just beyond that wall, so close and yet unreachable, as if he inhabited not merely another room, but another realm entirely. The servants treated her with a deference edged with pity that made her want to scream, for she was neither widow nor wife, but something suspended between states, a viscountess who commanded the household, yet had no access to the viscount, and she knew they whispered about her in the kitchens, wondered what she had done or failed to do to merit such abandonment, speculated about whether she would seek an annulment or simply fade into the half-life of permanent separation. But Catherine had discovered within herself a stubbornness she had not known she possessed, a refusal to accept that the locked door was the end of everything she had married. Adrian, for practical reasons, true, but she had also harbored hopes, small and carefully guarded, that they might build something meaningful together, and those hopes had not died with his seclusion, but had instead transformed into a quieter, deeper determination. She would not abandon him as he had abandoned her, would not cease reaching toward him, even if her hands met only wood and iron and silence, would not stop writing letters, even if they vanished into darkness and were never answered. For what else could she do? What else did she have except this daily ritual of connection attempted if not achieved, this insistence that a marriage existed even when one party refused to inhabit it? Adrian heard her footsteps each morning, the soft whisper of skirts against carpet, the measured pace that stopped just outside his door, and then the silence as she knelt. He imagined her kneeling, though he could not see to slide the letter beneath the narrow gap between door and floor, and he would wait, barely breathing, until her footsteps retreated before he moved from where he stood, pressed against the wall like a man hiding from executioners, waited until he was certain she had gone, before he approached the door and retrieved the cream-colored paper that had become his only connection to a world he had renounced. He read every letter, sometimes immediately, sometimes after hours of staring at the folded paper as if it might burn him, but always he read them, standing by the window where the light was strongest, his fingers, the only parts of him that remained unmarred, tracing her careful handwriting as if he could absorb something of her through the ink and paper, as if words could substitute for the presence he denied himself and denied her, though he told himself, endlessly, obsessively, that his denial was mercy, that his locked door was an act of love rather than cowardice. Asterisk. She must not see what I have become. Asterisk, he thought each morning when her shadow appeared beneath his door, that slim line of darkness that announced her presence as surely as a herald, and he would move to the door and stand there, his ruined face inches from the wood, his hand rising to touch the panel where he imagined her hand rested on the other side. separated by oak and iron, and his own implacable will, and sometimes he heard her breathe, thought he heard her breathe, or perhaps he only imagined it. But in those moments, the temptation to unlock the door nearly unmanned him entirely. The mirror in his chambers had been covered with cloth after the first week, after he had looked upon his reflection and seen not Adrian Ashford, but some Gothic horror. The left side of his face, a landscape of red and purple scarring that pulled his eye downward and twisted his mouth into a permanent suggestion of a sneer. The proud, straight nose now crooked, the smooth skin of his temple and cheek replaced by tissue that resembled melted wax, grotesque and shocking and utterly irreversible, according to the doctor who had dared suggest that her ladyship's presence might comfort him, as if Catherine should be subjected to this monstrosity, as if she should be asked to look upon him with anything other than revulsion or, worse, that terrible pitying kindness that would destroy him more thoroughly than the accident itself had done. He had released her, he told himself, by locking the door, released her from the obligation to tend a husband who had become an object of horror, freed her to live her life in whatever manner brought her peace, and if she chose to write letters he could not stop her, but neither would he encourage her by responding, though each letter made that resolution more difficult to maintain, for she wrote with such care, such attention to small beauties, such evident loneliness delicately expressed, that he found himself craving the next letter even as he dreaded it, found himself listening for her footsteps, like a prisoner listening for the guard, who brings both sustenance and reminder of captivity. Months later, winter arrived with the inevitability of judgment, transforming Thornwood Manor into a landscape of whites and greys, where the bare trees etched stark patterns against leaden skies and snow, muffled the world into a silence that seemed to Catherine both beautiful and oppressive, another layer of isolation added to the one she already endured. Yet she continued her morning ritual with a stubbornness that had calcified into something like faith, though faith in what she could not have precisely articulated faith, perhaps that persistence itself had value. That constancy meant something even when it appeared to mean nothing at all. Her letters had evolved, grown less tentative, as if she had decided that since he would not respond, she might as well write as she truly wished. And so she wrote with increasing honesty about her days, her thoughts, the small beauties she observed in the frozen gardens, and alongside the letters she began leaving gifts. A leather-bound volume of poetry she thought he might enjoy, retrieved from the London bookseller, a bottle of the French brandy she had discovered he preferred, ordered through the wine merchant, a scarf she had knitted herself during the long evenings alone, the work of her hands offered as evidence of time spent thinking of him, though she wondered if he would recognize the gesture for what it was or dismiss it as mere wifely duty performed without feeling. Adrian found each gift where she left it, arrayed beside the daily letter like offerings at a shrine, and he was undone by them in ways her words alone had not quite achieved, for the gifts were tangible proof of thought, of effort, of a care that could not be entirely explained by obligation, and the scarf especially tormented him. He held it in his ruined hands and imagined her sitting by the fire, needles clicking in the silence, creating something for him while he hid from her like a monster from a fairy story, and the soft wool seemed to carry her scent, or perhaps he only imagined it, but he pressed it to his face and felt something crack in the frozen wasteland of his chest. He began, tentatively, to respond not to her directly, that remained unthinkable, but through the valet he sent brief instructions about estate matters, formal and impersonal but nonetheless communications, threads of connection however thin, acknowledgements that her letters about the tenants and the accounts had been received and considered. And though he kept these responses purely practical, stripped of anything personal, they represented a breach in the wall he had built, a crack that let through the thinnest ray of light. Catherine received these messages: 3 lines about approving a repair, 2 sentences about selling timber, a brief note about tenant leases, with a joy entirely disproportionate to their content, for they were responses, proof that her letters reached him, that he read them, that she was not simply speaking into a void, and she treasured these scraps of attention as a miser treasures gold, reading them multiple times, analyzing every word for shades of meaning, searching for any hint of the man behind the formal instructions, and finding just enough to sustain her hope through the deepening winter, through the shortest days and longest nights, through the peculiar loneliness of Christmas spent in a house with another person who remained as absent as if he had never existed at all. A full year had passed since the door first locked, 365 days of separation marked by the patient accumulation of letters, when Catherine arrived at Adrian's chambers one February morning and found, instead of the usual silence that greeted her offerings, a folded piece of paper on the floor just beyond the threshold, pushed from inside his rooms to the corridor where she stood, a reversal that stopped her heart mid-beat. For in all these months he had never, not once, initiated contact in this manner, and her hands trembled as she knelt to retrieve it, the cream paper identical to her own stationery, and she recognized before she even unfolded it that this was his handwriting, his hand that had formed these letters, not dictated through a servant but written by him for her. The note contained only 3 sentences, formal and brief, regarding a discrepancy in the estate ledger she had mentioned in her letter from the previous week. Asterisk, Lady Ashford, the matter of the Western timber accounts has been reviewed. Please proceed with the sale as you suggested. Your management of the estate continues to be exemplary. Asterisk, 3 sentences, fewer than 40 words, utterly impersonal in their content, and yet Catherine stood in the corridor clutching the paper as tears streamed down her face, for these were his words, his acknowledgement, the first thing he had written directly to her in a year, and the fact that he had addressed her, had thanked her however formally, had communicated not through the valet but through his own effort, represented a crack in the wall so significant she could barely breathe for the hope that flooded through her. She returned to her chambers and sat at her writing desk, the note smoothed before her like a precious artifact, and composed her response with shaking hands, taking care to match his formal tone while infusing her words with warmth, writing about the timber sale and the accounts but adding observations about the snow in the gardens, the birds that had appeared at the window that morning, small personal details offered carefully, testing the boundaries of what he might accept, and she ended with a simple expression of gratitude for his response, nothing effusive or demanding, merely an acknowledgement that she had received his words and treasured them, though she did not write the word "times treasured" asterisk, for that would be too much, too revealing, and so she wrote instead that she was pleased to have his guidance, though pleased was entirely inadequate to describe the wild joy that made her hands unsteady as she formed each letter. She left this response at his door within the hour, unable to wait until the following morning, and resumed her day in a state of distraction, her mind returning again and again to those 3 sentences, analyzing each word, wondering if she had imagined the slight softening in the final line. The word "times" continues, times suggesting he had been aware all along of her work, had been watching in his way, had perhaps valued her efforts even when he could not bring himself to say so, and that night she slept with his note beneath her pillow, a talisman against the loneliness that had been her companion for so long, and when she woke the next morning, she found another note waiting, this one slightly longer, responding to her observations about the snow, and she understood with a clarity that stole her breath that something had shifted, that a door, not the physical door that remained locked, but some internal barrier had opened just enough to let through the possibility of connection, and she seized that possibility with both hands, writing back immediately, and thus began the tentative correspondence that would, in time, transform them both. Their correspondence developed through the remaining winter months with a momentum that felt to Catherine like watching ice begin to thaw, the letters arriving now with regularity, sometimes twice in a single day, and Adrian's words gradually lengthened, expanded, grew less guarded, the formal structure that had characterized his first notes giving way to something more natural, more revealing, as if he were slowly remembering how to speak to another human being after his long silence. They discussed books, Catherine mentioning a novel she had been reading, and Adrian responding with his own thoughts on the work, then recommending another volume, and soon they were engaged in a literary conversation that ranged from poetry to philosophy, from history to the natural sciences, and Catherine discovered that her husband possessed a mind of remarkable depth and breadth, that the cold, distant man she had married 3 years prior had been hiding not just his face but his entire self, all the complexity and intelligence and feeling that now spilled across the pages he slid beneath his door. They debated the merits of various philosophers, argued gently about interpretations of Shakespeare's tragedies, discussed the agricultural improvements being implemented across England and whether such changes were entirely beneficial or came with hidden costs, and these conversations conducted entirely through ink and paper, with sometimes hours or days between response and reply, felt to Catherine more intimate than any spoken exchange she had experienced in her life, for writing allowed a vulnerability that speech did not, the careful selection of words, the ability to express thoughts fully without interruption, the permanent record of feelings that might have evaporated in the air between two people, but instead remained fixed on paper, readable again and again, proof that these thoughts had been thought and these feelings felt. Catherine recognized, with a clarity that made her heart ache with both joy and sorrow, that this was the courtship they had never had, that Adrian was wooing her through words in a way he had never attempted in person, and she responded in kind, letting her own personality emerge more fully in her letters, her humor and her observations, and her quiet strength, all the things she had kept carefully hidden during their brief, formal marriage, and she sensed him responding to this revelation of her true self, his letters growing warmer in tone if not yet in explicit content, for they still avoided anything too personal, still skirted around the edges of their situation, the locked door and the separation and the years of silence. As if by unspoken agreement, they had decided that these practical matters need not intrude upon the world they were building together in their correspondence, a world where they could be simply two minds meeting, two souls discovering each other without the complications of bodies and appearances and all the pain that attended physical reality. Adrian found himself living for these exchanges, his days organized around the arrival of her letters and the composition of his responses, hours spent at his desk drafting and redrafting his words, trying to express thoughts he had kept locked away as firmly as he had locked his door, and he realized, though he could not yet have admitted it even to himself, and that he was falling in love with his wife through this strange, constrained medium, that the woman who emerged from these letters was someone he wanted to know more deeply than he had ever wanted anything, and the door that separated them seemed simultaneously insurmountable and increasingly absurd, a barrier that protected him from her imagined horror at his appearance, but also prevented the very connection he craved with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. As spring arrived at Thornwood Manor, bringing with it the tender green of new leaves and the soft insistence of warmth after winter's long grip, the correspondence between Adrian and Catherine shifted in a manner so gradual that neither could have identified the precise moment when their letters ceased to be merely intellectual exchanges and became instead confessions of the heart, though if pressed Catherine might have traced this evolution to the morning in late March, when Adrian's letter, instead of discussing the merits of a particular historian's interpretation of the Roman Empire, asked her a question so simple and yet so profound that she had stared at the words for a full minute before understanding their significance. Asterisk, what do you do with your afternoons, Catherine, when the estate business is concluded and the house grows quiet? Asterisk, he had used her Christian name without the formal lady that had preceded it in all previous correspondence, and he had asked not about her duties or her opinions on some abstract matter, but about her actual life, the hours of her days, the texture of her existence, and she had responded with care, describing her walks in the garden, her reading, the watercolors she had taken up again after years of neglect, and then, because his question had opened a door she had not dared approach before, she wrote about her loneliness, not with accusation or self-pity, but with simple honesty. Asterisk, the afternoons are long, Adrian, and I confess there are moments when the silence of this great house feels less like peace and more like absence, when I wonder what it might be like to share these hours with someone who might wish to know how I spend them. Asterisk. She had hesitated before including this last line, her pen hovering above the paper, wondering if she was pushing too far, too fast, but she had sealed the letter before caution could overtake courage, and his response had come within hours, faster than usual, and his words had made her heart stammer in her chest. Asterisk, I wish to know everything about your hours, Catherine. I have wondered about your afternoons, your mornings, your evenings, every moment that passes, while I sit behind this damned door like a coward, too afraid to claim the life that waits beyond it. Asterisk. It was the first time he had acknowledged the door, the separation, the abnormality of their situation, and it was the first time he had revealed frustration with his own choices, anger at himself rather than at fate or circumstance, and Catherine understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful dance they had been performing through their letters had moved into new territory, dangerous and thrilling and terrifying in its intimacy, and from that day forward their correspondence became a kind of courtship conducted with increasing boldness. Adrian writing about his own fears, not in abstract philosophical terms, but in direct, personal language, telling her that he dreamed of her voice, that he remembered the way she had smiled at something amusing during dinner in those brief months before the accident, that he feared his scars would repel her, but feared more that his isolation had already destroyed whatever chance they might have had for happiness, and Catherine responding with her own truth, that she had fallen in love with the man who wrote these letters, that she knew his soul now in ways she never could have known it, through mere physical proximity, that his scars could mean nothing to her when his words had already shown her the beauty of his mind and heart, and the household staff, who had grown accustomed to the strange arrangement of their master and mistress, began to notice that Lady Catherine moved through the manor with a lightness that had been absent for years, that she smiled more readily, that she seemed to glow with some inner radiance that transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful, and they whispered among themselves that perhaps the lady had taken a lover, for what else could explain this sudden joy, not understanding that she had indeed fallen in love, but with her own husband, and that he had fallen equally in love with her, and that they were conducting their affair through paper and ink, consummating their devotion through words that could not touch, but somehow conveyed more tenderness than any physical caress they had yet shared. The fever came upon Catherine in early May, 2 years and 3 months after the door had first locked, arriving with the sudden violence of a spring storm that had no respect for the fragile happiness she and Adrian had been building through their letters, and it began as nothing more than a headache and slight chill that she dismissed as fatigue from overseeing the planting of the kitchen gardens. But by evening she was trembling so violently that her maid had to help her to bed, and by the following morning her skin burned with a heat that seemed to come from some furnace deep within her body. And the doctor was summoned from the village, his grave expression as he examined her sending the household staff into whispers of concern and fear, for fever was a common enough visitor to English manor houses, but one that left as often with a life claimed as with a patient restored. And Adrian, in his chambers, heard the unusual commotion in the hallway, and the rapid footsteps and hushed, urgent voices, and when his valet knocked to inform him that Lady Catherine had taken seriously ill, something seized in his chest like a fist closing around his heart, and he crossed immediately to the door that connected his chambers to the corridor, pressing his ear against the wood, as he had done countless times over the past 2 years, but this time listening not for her morning footsteps, or the soft sound of a letter being slid beneath his door, but for any information about her condition, any fragment of conversation that might tell him whether she would live or die. And for 3 days he remained there, sleeping only in brief intervals on the floor beside the door, listening as the doctor came and went, as the maids carried water and linens, as the housekeeper's voice directed the nursing efforts with calm efficiency. And on the second night he heard Catherine in her delirium, her voice high and strange and broken by fever, calling out words he could not quite discern, and then, clear as a bell through the heavy oak, he heard her call his name Adrian, not with fear or accusation, but with longing, with need, with a vulnerability that shattered something fundamental inside him, and his hand went to the door handle, closed around the cold metal, his entire body trembling with the effort of confronting the choice that stood before him, and he remained frozen there for what might have been minutes or hours, his hand on the handle and his forehead pressed against the wood, wanting with an intensity that bordered on madness to open the door, to go to her, to take her hand and tell her he was there, that she was not alone, but unable to move, unable to turn the handle, because the fear that had kept him imprisoned for 2 years still had its claws in him, the terror that she would look upon his ruined face and recoil, that the intimacy they had built through letters would dissolve the moment physical reality intruded, and he hated himself with a purity of loathing he had never experienced, even in the darkest days after his accident, hated that he was such a coward that he could not go to his own wife when she called for him in her illness, could not offer her even the comfort of his presence when she might be dying mere yards away from where he stood, paralyzed by vanity and fear, and he paced his chambers like a caged animal, back and forth, his limp more pronounced due to agitation, his hands pulling at his hair, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and the battle that raged within him was between the man he had become isolated, afraid, ruled by shame, and the man he wanted to be, the man Catherine's letters had shown him he might still become, if only he could find the courage to step beyond the prison of his own making. On the 5th day, when the fever finally broke and Catherine woke to find herself weak as a newborn lamb, her nightgown damp with the sweat of crisis past, and her throat raw, and her limbs trembling with the effort of simply sitting upright against the pillows her maid had arranged, the first thing she thought of was not her own relief at having survived, nor gratitude for the doctor's skill or the staff's devoted nursing, but rather the fact that during her delirium she had called for Adrian and he had not come, and this knowledge settled into her chest, not with anger or even disappointment, for she had long ago accepted the parameters of their strange marriage, but with a clarity that felt like the fever had burned away all pretense and left only truth, raw and undeniable, and she understood with sudden and complete certainty that she could not continue as they had been, that something had to change or break or end, that 2 years of letters, however tender, however intimate, could not substitute for a life actually lived together, and so when her maid had left her with tea and toast that she was too weak to eat, Catherine reached for her writing desk with shaking hands and pulled forth paper and pen, and she began to write a letter unlike any she had sent before, without careful construction or diplomatic phrasing or the protective distance she had always maintained, but instead with the kind of honesty that only comes when one has looked at death closely enough to see one's own reflection in its eyes and realize that time is not infinite, that patience can become complicity in one's own unhappiness, that love, unspoken and unlived, is a kind of slow death all its own. Adrian *, she wrote, her hand barely steady enough to form the letters. I have just woken from a fever that might have killed me, and the first thing I understood upon waking was that I have been dying by degrees for 2 years, not from illness, but from loneliness, from living in the same house with a man I love but never seeing, never touching, never sharing more than words on paper, and I must tell you now, while I am still weak enough to be brave, that I can no longer bear it, not because I do not treasure our correspondence, I treasure it more than I can express, but because I have fallen in love with you through your letters, Adrian, wholly and completely in love with your mind and your heart and your soul, and I know you fear your scars will repel me, that the injuries you suffered have made you somehow monstrous or unworthy of love, but I must tell you that I do not care about your scars. I cannot care about them when I have read your thoughts and your fears and your dreams and found them so beautiful that my heart aches with the wanting of you, and I heard you at the door during my fever, Adrian. I was not so far gone that I did not know you were there, your hand on the handle, and I understood that you wanted to come to me but could not, and I forgive you for that. I forgive you for everything, but I cannot continue to live this half-life, loving you through paper and ink while we waste the years we might have together, and so I am asking you not to open the door, for I will not demand what you cannot freely give, but I am telling you the complete truth of my heart, so that you will know, whatever you choose, that you are loved, scars and all, that you have always been loved, and that if you can find the courage to step beyond that door, I will be here, waiting, for whatever time we have left in this world. She sealed the letter before courage could fail her, before weakness could make her soften the words or add qualifications that would blunt their edge, and she asked her maid to place it at his door as usual, and then she lay back against the pillows, exhausted and trembling and more terrified than she had been even in the depths of fever, because she had finally told the truth, complete and unvarnished, and now there was nothing to do but wait and see if truth was enough to break down the walls that fear had built. Adrian found the letter just after dawn, slipped beneath his door as all her letters had been, but when he unfolded the paper and began to read, his hands started trembling before he had finished the first sentence, and by the time he reached her confession of love, his vision had blurred, with tears he had not shed since the day of the accident, and he read the letter again immediately, then a third time, then a fourth, each reading peeling away another layer of the defenses he had built around himself, the rationalizations and justifications and elaborate architecture of fear that had kept him imprisoned for 2 years. And with each reading, Catherine's words struck deeper, her honest confession of loving him despite his scars, her gentle revelation that she had heard him at the door during her fever, and understood both his desire to come to her and his inability to do so, her forgiveness offered before he had even asked for it, and most devastating of all, her statement that she could no longer bear the half-life they were living, that patience had reached its limit, that time was not infinite, and he understood, with sickening clarity, that his isolation, which he had always told himself was an act of mercy to spare her from his monstrous appearance, had in fact been the deepest cruelty, that by hiding himself away he had not protected her, but rather condemned her to a loneliness as profound as his own, perhaps more so because she had chosen to stay, to write, to love, while he had chosen only to hide. And the self-loathing that had sustained his isolation for 2 years transformed in that moment into something else, a fury at himself for wasting so much time, for causing her so much pain, for being too much a coward to accept the love she was offering. And he crossed to the mirror that he had covered with cloth on the day he first locked himself away, and he tore the cloth down and forced himself to look at what he had become, the scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheek to his jaw, the way it pulled his mouth slightly to one side, the matching scar on his neck where the boar's tusk had caught him as he fell. And yes, the scars were ugly, disfiguring, permanent, but as he stared at his reflection, he remembered Catherine's words, "Times I have read your thoughts and your fears and your dreams, and found them so beautiful that my heart aches with the wanting of you times." And he understood suddenly that she was right, that the scars were nothing, that they had never been the real barrier, that the true prison had always been his own mind, his own fear, his own inability to believe himself worthy of love. And he stood there before the mirror as morning light slowly filled his chambers, the letter clutched in his hand, and the battle that raged within him was fierce and terrible. Self-hatred, warring against the desperate hope that her words had kindled, fear fighting against love, and the desire to remain hidden struggling against the realization that if he did not act now, if he did not find the courage Catherine had shown in writing her letter, he would lose her not to death but to something worse, to resignation, to a lifetime of existing in proximity but never truly together. And as dawn broke fully over Thornwood Manor, something crystallized in Adrian's chest, a decision made not with certainty or confidence, but with the desperate clarity of a man who has finally seen the edge of the abyss and chosen to step back. And he knew what he had to do, knew that words would no longer suffice, that after 2 years of letters, the time had come for action, for the physical destruction of the barrier he had built. And his hands stopped trembling as purpose replaced paralysis, and he turned from the mirror toward the door that had been locked for so long, knowing that within the hour it would cease to exist. Catherine woke with the first light of morning, still weak from her illness, her body feeling as though it were made of gossamer and air, and she lay against the pillows watching dawn paint the walls of her chamber in shades of rose and gold, her mind turning over the letter she had sent the previous day, wondering if she had been too honest, too vulnerable, if she had frightened him away entirely, or if perhaps her words had reached something in him that all her careful patience had not. And she was contemplating whether she had the strength to rise and dress when a sound shattered the morning quiet, a tremendous crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of Thornwood Manor, followed by another and another, the sound of wood splintering and breaking, and Catherine sat upright despite her weakness, her heart suddenly racing, and she heard voices in the corridor, servants crying out in alarm, footsteps running, and then another crash, louder than before, and she knew, with sudden absolute certainty, what was happening, knew it in her bones and blood before her mind could fully comprehend it, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes, because Adrian was breaking down his door, was destroying the barrier he had built 3 years ago, was tearing apart the symbol of his isolation with what sounded like savage determination, and the crashes continued, rhythmic and violent, and the sound of an axe biting into wood, and Catherine could hear his voice now through the chaos, a wordless cry of effort and anguish, and something that might have been rage or might have been release, and the household was in uproar. She could hear Mrs. Davies shouting for someone to fetch help, other servants asking what was happening, whether the master had gone mad. But Catherine understood that this was not madness but rather its opposite. This was sanity returning after 3 years of self-imposed exile. This was a man fighting his way out of his own prison. And then there was one final tremendous crash, different from the others, the sound of something large and heavy falling, and silence followed, sudden and complete, as though the entire manor were holding its breath, and Catherine found herself on her feet, though she did not remember rising, her hand gripping the bedpost for support, her whole body trembling with weakness and emotion, and she heard footsteps in the corridor outside Adrian's chambers, slow and uneven, the familiar rhythm of his limp, and she realized he was walking through the ruined doorway, was stepping out into the corridor for the first time in 3 years, and her tears were falling freely now, and she moved toward her own door on legs that barely supported her, needing to see him, needing to witness this moment of transformation. And when she opened her door and looked down the corridor toward his chambers, she saw him standing in the hallway, surrounded by servants who had frozen in shock, saw the destroyed door lying in splinters behind him, saw him trembling and breathing hard from exertion, the axe still in his hand, his scarred face visible to all of them, and their eyes met across the distance, and in his gaze Catherine saw fear and love and desperate hope and the terrible vulnerability of a man who has finally destroyed his own prison and now stands exposed before the world. And she took one step toward him, then another, and nothing else mattered but crossing the space between them. Adrian let the axe fall from his hand, and it clattered against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. And he stood there in the corridor surrounded by shocked servants, his chest heaving, his scarred face fully visible in the morning light, for the first time in 3 years. And when he saw Catherine emerge from her chambers, pale and trembling from illness, but moving toward him with tears streaming down her face, every remaining fragment of his courage coalesced into purpose, and he began to walk, each step a deliberate act of will, his limp more pronounced than usual from exertion and 3 years of disuse, and the servants parted before him like water, their faces showing shock and pity and curiosity, but he looked only at Catherine, at the woman who had waited with such impossible patience, who had loved him through paper and ink when he would not allow her to love him in flesh and breath. And as he drew closer, he could see every detail of her face, the pallor left by her illness, the tracks of tears on her cheeks, the way her hands trembled as she reached toward him. And when he finally stood before her, they were both crying, both trembling, both afraid and hopeful in equal measure, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, truly looked, without barriers of wood or pride or fear between them, and Catherine's gaze moved across his face, taking in the scars he had hidden for so long, the twisted tissue that ran from temple to jaw, the way his mouth pulled slightly to one side, the marks of violence and survival that he had convinced himself made him monstrous, and he waited for her to flinch, to look away, to show some sign of the revulsion he had always imagined, but instead, her expression filled with such tender recognition, such pure love, that his breath caught in his throat, and she lifted her hand slowly, giving him time to retreat if he wished. But he did not retreat, could not retreat, had spent 3 years retreating, and would retreat no more. And when her fingers touched his scarred cheek with infinite gentleness, when her palm curved to cup his face, and her thumb traced the line of the scar as though it was something precious, rather than shameful, something broke open in Adrian's chest, some final defense crumbling into dust, and he turned his face into her touch, like a man starved for contact, which he was. And Catherine made a small sound that was half sob and half laugh, and she whispered his name, just his name, and it was the first time he had heard her voice directed at him rather than through a door in 3 years. And the sound of it undid him completely, and he reached for her with shaking hands, touching her face as she touched his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheek, learning through touch what he had denied himself through sight, and they stood there in the corridor with servants watching and morning light streaming through the windows, 2 people who had been married for 3 years finally meeting for the first time. And Catherine smiled through her tears and said, "You broke down your door," and Adrian's voice, rough from disuse and emotion, replied, "I should have done it 3 years ago." Adrian found himself unable to speak further, his throat closed with emotion, and Catherine seemed to understand because she took his hand and led him back down the corridor toward her chambers, away from the curious eyes of servants, and when they were alone behind her closed door, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Into this room, filled with morning light and the 3 years of longing that hung between them, like something almost tangible, and Adrian's voice, when he finally found it, was rough and broken as he said, "Catherine, I have been such a fool, such a coward. I locked myself away and told myself it was for your sake, that I was sparing you the sight of what I had become. But all I did was hurt you. All I did was waste 3 years we could have spent together, and I am so profoundly sorry. I do not know how to express the depth of my regret." And tears were streaming down his scarred face, and Catherine reached up to wipe them away with gentle fingers, and she said, "Stop, please stop. There is nothing to forgive. You were in pain and you did what you thought you must to survive it. We cannot reclaim the time that has passed, but we have all the time ahead of us, and that is what matters now." But Adrian shook his head and continued, his words tumbling out after 3 years of silence. "I read every letter you wrote, every single one. I would wait for the sound of your footsteps, and then I would retrieve your letters from beneath the door, and I would read them over and over until I had memorized every word, and through your words I came to know you, truly know you. And I fell in love with you, Catherine. I fell in love with your patience and your kindness and your intelligence and your hope. I fell in love with the woman who would not abandon me, even when I tried to abandon her. And when you were ill and I heard you calling for me through the door, I nearly broke then. I stood with my hand on the lock, and I wanted desperately to go to you, but I was still too much of a coward. And then your last letter, your beautiful, honest letter, it broke through every defense I had built, and I realized that my isolation had become a greater cruelty than my scars could ever be." And Catherine was crying now too, and she took both his hands in hers and said, "I fell in love with you too, through ink and paper. I fell in love with your mind and your soul. You wrote to me about books and philosophy, and I saw the man you truly are beneath the scars you think define you. And Adrian, my dearest Adrian, those scars are simply part of you now. They do not diminish you. They do not make you less. They are marks of survival, and they cannot change how I see you." And he pulled her close then, carefully as though she might break, mindful of her recent illness. And she came into his arms without hesitation, and they held each other for the first time in 3 years, for the first time truly ever, and it was both the reunion of long-separated lovers and the beginning of something entirely new. And Adrian buried his face in her hair and breathed in the scent of her and felt her heart beating against his chest. And Catherine's arms tightened around him and she whispered, "You are here, you are finally here." And they stood together in the golden morning light, with 3 years of letters between them and a lifetime stretching ahead. And everything that had been broken was beginning, at last, to heal. The following weeks unfolded like the slow turning of pages in a book long left unread, and Adrian emerged into his own household as though into foreign territory. Each step beyond his former chambers, a small act of courage that Catherine witnessed with patient pride, and at first the servants would stare when he passed, their eyes drawn to the scars that marked his face before they remembered their training and looked away. And Adrian felt each glance like a physical touch, a reminder of the monster he had believed himself to be, but Catherine was always there beside him, her hand in his or her presence at his shoulder, and when he faltered, she would steady him not with words, but with the simple constancy of her faith in him. And gradually the household adjusted, the initial shock fading into acceptance, and then into something warmer as they witnessed the devotion between the Viscount and his lady. And Adrian began to remember what it was to live rather than merely exist, to walk through rooms filled with light rather than to hide in shadow, to speak aloud rather than to communicate only through written words, though the letters continued because some habits were too precious to abandon. And each morning Catherine would find a note tucked beneath her pillow or slipped into her book, small missives that said the things Adrian found easier to write than speak, declarations of love and gratitude and wonder that she had waited for him, and she would write back, leaving her responses in the pockets of his coat or folded into his napkin at breakfast. And this epistolary courtship that had begun through a locked door now became a tender game between them, a private language of paper and ink that belonged to them alone, and they walked the gardens together in the afternoons, Adrian's limp more pronounced on the uneven paths, but Catherine matching his pace without comment, without the pity that would have wounded him, and sometimes she would link her arm through his for balance, and sometimes he would pause to catch his breath, and she would wait beside him, pointing out the first roses or the way the light fell through the trees, giving him time without making him feel diminished. And physical intimacy developed slowly between them. Carefully, each touch a question asked and answered, his fingers learning the curve of her waist as hers learned the landscape of his scars. And there were moments when Adrian would freeze, when old fears would surface, and he would pull away, certain that she must be repulsed despite all evidence to the contrary. And Catherine would give him space but never distance. They would wait until he returned to her, as he always did. And one night when she kissed the scarred side of his face with deliberate tenderness, he wept, and she held him and whispered that every part of him was dear to her, that his scars were part of his story, and therefore part of what she loved. And trust was rebuilt in these small moments, through patience and presence, and the gradual understanding that love need not be perfect to be real, that healing was not an event but a process, and that they had all the time in the world to learn each other beyond the words they had written, to become in flesh what they had begun on paper. Months passed and spring surrendered to summer, and with the changing season came a transformation not only in Adrian and Catherine, but in their relationship to Thornwood itself. For Adrian had spent 3 years knowing his estate only through ledgers and reports and Catherine's detailed letters, and now he wished to see it through his own eyes, and to meet the tenants whose names he knew, but whose faces had become distant memories. And so they began to ride out together across the lands that were his responsibility and his heritage, Catherine side-saddle on her gentle mare, and Adrian on the stallion he had not ridden since before the accident, his seat less sure than it once was, but determined nonetheless. And their first visit was to the Hendersons' farm on the eastern border, and Adrian felt his stomach clench as they approached, knowing that Thomas Henderson had been with him on the hunt the day of the accident, had witnessed the fall and the blood and the terrible aftermath. And when Thomas came out of the farmhouse, his eyes widened at the sight of the Viscount, and there was a moment of terrible suspended silence before Catherine said something warm about the fields looking prosperous, and Thomas seemed to recover himself and began speaking of drainage issues and crop rotation, and gradually the awkwardness faded, though Adrian could feel the man's eyes drawn again and again to his scars. But Thomas's children had no such restraint, and they stared openly until their mother scolded them, and it was Catherine who knelt down to their level and spoke gently to them, explaining that their lord had been hurt, but was quite well now. And the youngest girl, emboldened, asked if it hurt, and Adrian found himself answering honestly that it had once but did not anymore. And something in that simple exchange broke the tension, and by the time they left the Hendersons' farm, Adrian felt as though he had crossed some invisible threshold. And over the following weeks, they visited every tenant, farm and cottage, and each visit became easier than the last, and Adrian began to see that while people might initially react to his appearance, they quickly adjusted, especially when they witnessed the way Catherine looked at him, the obvious devotion between the Viscount and his lady. And there was something powerful in being seen together, in Catherine's hand resting naturally on his arm, or her smile when she glanced at him, for her lack of revulsion gave others permission to look past the scars to the man beneath. And Adrian found himself genuinely interested in the lives of these people he had neglected for so long, discussing improvements to cottages, listening to concerns about flood walls and market prices, and Catherine would add her own observations, for she had been managing much of the estate in his absence, and knew these families well. And watching her move among the tenants with such natural grace and genuine care, Adrian felt a surge of pride and love so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. And one evening, as they rode back through fields golden with late summer sun, he turned to her and said, "I built my own prison, did I not? All this time I believed the world would reject me, but it was I who rejected the world." And Catherine reached across the space between their horses to take his hand and replied, "But you are here now, and that is what matters. You have come back to the living, to me, to all of this." And they began to speak of the future, of improvements they might make, not only to the estate but to their lives, of the children they might have to inherit these fields and forests, of growing old together in a house that had once felt like a mausoleum but was beginning to feel like a home. And Adrian realized that the true prison had never been his chambers, but his own fear, and Catherine had given him not only her love, but the courage to unlock the door. Adrian stood before the splintered remains of his chamber door in the days following its destruction, and something stirred within him, a recognition that the physical barrier he had shattered was only the most visible symbol of walls that needed dismantling, and so he summoned the estate's master carpenter and made a request that caused the man's eyebrows to rise in surprise. He wished the door rebuilt, but this time with panels of glass set into the frame, clear glass that would allow light to pass through and forms to be visible on either side. No more solid oak barriers that transformed rooms into prisons. And the carpenter nodded slowly, understanding perhaps more than Adrian had spoken aloud, and within a fortnight the work began, and Adrian and Catherine watched as craftsmen installed a door that was both boundary and window, privacy without isolation, a threshold that invited crossing rather than forbade it, and Catherine stood beside him as the final pane was set in place and said quietly, "No more locked doors between us." Then, and he took her hand and agreed, never again. And the rebuilding did not stop there, for they began to redesign the chambers themselves, knocking through the wall that separated Adrian's apartments from Catherine's, so that the space flowed from one room to the next, creating a shared sanctuary where before there had been division, and Catherine chose fabrics in warm colors to replace the dark hangings that had made Adrian's chambers feel like a tomb, and together they selected furniture that spoke of comfort rather than austerity, of a life lived rather than endured. And as the physical space transformed, so too did the emotional landscape between them, for they spoke now of things long left unsaid, of the time wasted in fear and isolation, of regrets that could not be changed but could be learned from, and they spoke too of hope, of the future stretching before them full of possibility. And one evening, as they sat together in the newly opened space, Catherine's head resting against Adrian's shoulder, she said softly that she wished to fill Thornwood with more than just the two of them, that she wanted the house to ring with children's laughter and to be a home in truth rather than simply an estate. And Adrian felt something catch in his throat at the image she painted, at the life she was offering him, a life he had believed himself unworthy of, but which she insisted he deserved. And he kissed her temple and whispered, "Yes, yes," to all of it, to every dream she held. And as autumn arrived and the leaves turned gold and crimson, Catherine came to him with news that made his heart stutter, and saw she was with child. Their child, a new life born of the love they had cultivated through letters and patience and the courage to break down doors. And Adrian's joy was so profound it frightened him in its intensity, this happiness that seemed too vast to contain, too precious to trust. But Catherine laughed at his wonder, and took his hand and placed it on her belly, where no change was yet visible, and said, "You see, we are not endings but beginnings, you and I." And he understood then that this was what healing looked like, not the erasure of scars but the building of new stories over old wounds, not forgetting what had been lost, but choosing to embrace what could still be found. And the house itself seemed to breathe differently around them, lighter somehow, as though Thornwood too was being rebuilt from the inside out. 3 years had passed since the morning. Adrian shattered his chamber door with an axe. 3 years measured not in isolation but in togetherness, the same span of time that had once been marked by locked doors and unanswered letters, now filled instead with laughter and light, and the particular chaos that small children bring to even the grandest of houses. And on an autumn morning very like the one when this story began, Adrian stood in the entrance hall of Thornwood Manor watching his daughter, nearly 2 years old now, dark-haired and fearless, toddle across the marble floor with determined steps, while his son, barely 6 months, dozed in Catherine's arms. And the transformation of the house was complete, for where once there had been whispers and pitying glances from servants, there was now the comfortable bustle of a household fully alive, maids who smiled as they worked, and footmen who no longer averted their eyes from their master's scarred face. And Catherine descended the stairs with the particular grace of a woman who had grown into her role as mistress of this estate, no longer the uncertain bride who had written tentative letters to a husband who would not see her, but a woman confident in her place and in her love. And she caught Adrian's eye, and smiled in that way that still made his heart stutter even after all this time. And he crossed to her and kissed her temple, and took their son from her arms, so that she might have a free hand to catch their daughter before she attempted to climb the hall table. And they walked together through corridors that had once echoed with loneliness, but now rang with life, past the library where the original splintered door from Adrian's chambers was mounted on the wall behind glass and preserved as Catherine had insisted it should be, a reminder of the day everything changed, and sometimes Adrian would stand before it and marvel at how close he had come to losing everything through his own fear. How the prison he had built might have remained forever sealed had Catherine not possessed the courage to write truth when politeness might have been easier, and they walked now to the breakfast room where cook had prepared a family meal, something that would have been unthinkable in the old days when the Viscount took his meals alone and his wife dined in solitary formality. And as they settled around the table, their daughter in her high chair and their son cradled nearby, Adrian reached across and took Catherine's hand, a gesture he made often, needing still to reassure himself that she was real, that this life was real, that he had not dreamed his way out of that dark chamber. And later, when the children were with their nurse and the house settled into afternoon quiet, Adrian retired to his study and took out paper and ink, for he still wrote to Catherine, left letters on her pillow or tucked into books she was reading, small notes that said the things he feared he might forget to speak aloud, expressions of love and gratitude and wonder that she had waited for him, that she had refused to abandon him even when he had abandoned himself. And Catherine treasured each one, kept them in a box inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and sometimes when he could not sleep, he would find her reading them by candlelight, her fingers tracing words he had written, and she would look up and smile, and he would know that the door between them, once so brutally destroyed, would never exist again. Evening settled over Thornwood Manor with the gentleness of a benediction. The sky streaked with amber and rose as the family gathered once more around the dining table, and Adrian watched Catherine cut their daughter's food into small pieces, while their son gurgled contentedly in the cradle beside her chair, and he felt that peculiar tightness in his chest that he had come to recognize as overwhelming gratitude, the kind that made one believe in providence or fate or whatever force had guided Catherine's hand when she wrote that final letter, the one that had broken through his defenses and given him the courage to take an axe to his own prison. And as the meal concluded, and the children were taken up to the nursery, and Catherine returned to sit beside him in the drawing-room, her hand finding his with the ease of long habit, Adrian knew that this was happiness, not the absence of scars or difficulty, but the presence of someone who chose to stay through both. And the story of their love was perhaps an unusual one, built as it was on locked doors and desperate letters and 3 years of isolation that might have destroyed them, but instead became the foundation of something unshakable. And perhaps, dear listener, that is what I wish you to understand from their tale, that the walls we build around ourselves, whether from fear or shame, or the belief that we are protecting others from our own perceived monstrousness, become prisons far more terrible than any external judgment could ever be. That isolation, no matter how we justify it, no matter how much we convince ourselves it is noble or necessary, is ultimately a form of self-destruction that wounds not only ourselves, but those who love us. And Catherine and Adrian's story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to break down the barriers we have constructed, even when our hands tremble on the axe, even when we are certain that what lies on the other side of the door will be rejection or horror. And sometimes, often even, what we find instead is grace, is love that sees beyond the surface to the soul beneath. And their story teaches too about patience, about the kind of love that continues to write letters to a locked door, that refuses to abandon even when abandonment would be easier, that waits not passively but with active hope, with daily renewed commitment, with the understanding that some transformations cannot be rushed, but must unfold in their own time. And if you find yourself behind a locked door of your own making, whether literal or metaphorical, whether built from trauma or shame or fear, or simply the weight of years of accumulated pain, know that it is never too late to reach for the axe, never too late to shatter the barrier and step through into the light. And if you are the one writing letters to someone else's locked door, know that your patience is not weakness but strength, that your refusal to abandon is a form of love that can change everything. And perhaps we are all in our own ways, both Adrian and Catherine, both the one hiding and the one hoping, both the one who must find courage to emerge and the one who must find courage to keep faith. And the letters we write, whether to others or to ourselves, whether on paper or in the silent language of persistent presence, matter more than we know, carry more weight than we imagine. And sometimes a single letter, a single moment of raw honesty can be the thing that finally breaks through. And so I wish you the courage to destroy your own doors, the patience to wait for others to destroy theirs, the wisdom to know which role you are called to play in each moment. And may you find, as Adrian and Catherine did, that on the other side of fear and isolation lies not the rejection you dreaded, but the connection you needed all along. And may you rest well tonight, dear listener, knowing that no door is so firmly locked that love cannot find a way through. And if you found meaning in this story, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to share this tale with someone who might need to hear it, and to remember always that the most profound transformations often begin with the smallest acts of courage: a letter slipped under a door, a hand that refuses to stop knocking, a heart that dares to hope when hope seems foolish. For in the end, we are all stories of doors locked and doors opened, of isolation chosen and connection reclaimed, and the tale we tell with our lives is written not in the barriers we build, but in the moments we find the strength to tear them down.